right, so to get over my nerves of doing the first episode on this, I do have a script, so pardon me for reading with a lot of this. Hello, and welcome to my channel, Bikinis and Boarding School. This is my first boarding school episode, so welcome to episode 1. Let's kick things off. So I'm your host, Jill Humphrey. I am an IFBB Bikini Pro. I'm a wife, mother, dog mom, business professional, and now apparently YouTube content creator. So this has been on my mind for a long time to start this, and what better time than the present? So let's get started. Today in my first episode about boarding schools, I'm going to be sharing some of my own stories, pictures, and experiences. I'm also going to be touching on something known as boarding school syndrome, which explains from a psychological perspective the lasting impact on a person's psyche who has been sent off to boarding school at a young age. In each one of my boarding school episodes, I'm also going to share a story or a review for someone who experienced their own version of what I went through. And I'll also share my reaction to these stories. Finding these reviews, comments, and stories online is actually what birthed the idea a few years back. And this has really been on my mind and my heart to do ever since. Somehow reading about other people's trauma validated my own experience in a way that I had yet to come to terms with. In future episodes, I'm going to be interviewing some of my former classmates to get their stories and perspectives. I'm going to be covering some topics that might be triggering for some. So if this isn't conducive or supportive to your journey, feel free to tap out now. But for those of you who aren't scared to dig up the past, hit those triggers in order to transmute negativity and heal, then you're in the right place. Because my experience felt somehow normalized, because I lived it, and thinking that I had resolved my issues around boarding school sometime in my late 20s, it was kind of shocking to me when around the age of 40, I found myself deeply impacted and emotional after stumbling across a Reddit thread and some stories of women who had been sent to the same boarding school as me. Then I found the Yelp reviews. And I read them with morbid fascination and a visceral emotional response. I was physically struck by these stories, experiencing again that low-grade nausea that was with me so often when I was away at boarding school. As I read these stories, I remembered who some of these girls were based on the details they shared or by their first names. My heart was heavy and I got emotional and teared up as I read about the neglect, trauma, and abuse these women had suffered. In reading their stories and feeling empathy for them, it started to click that I too had experienced trauma, and some of it lingered into adulthood. It wasn't until I heard the other women's stories that I was able to emotionally connect on the deepest level to my own pain and see my experience for what it actually was. In the following couple years, I would see a few documentaries about wilderness programs like Teen Challenge and other institutional teen reform programs, and I was triggered in a way that called me to action. I've literally done every piece of this except telling my actual story. I've made the thumbnails, I've written the notes, I've built the file, everything except actually sitting here in front of the camera and talking about my experience. My story and the stories of the girls of Holy Highway get told starting today. Holy Highway Christian Girls Academy was a school that used rules, religion, and reform for their students. All of us arrived troubled. Many of us left traumatized, but all of us left permanently changed. What was it? Holy Highway was also known as a home for wayward girls. It was a non-denominational religious all-girls boarding school in New Boston, Texas. The original Holy Highway was founded in 1987 in Picton, Texas. The two were sister schools, but independently run and had different rules and feels to them. To us girls at New Boston, Picton seemed like a laid-back, more, a less strict environment, but that was just our perception, probably not facts. Here's a quote from the Reddit thread regarding the Picton location of Holy Highway. The Holy Highway Christian Girls Home, Picton, Texas, made millions off of desperate parents of troubled teenage girls while subjecting them to all kinds of abuse and indoctrination. Please spread this like wildfire. It's interesting in the wake of the Me Too movement to have victims come out and find the courage to speak about what they went through and what I'm doing, I hope, is a tribute to the pain and trauma that the women that experienced these schools in their early teen years experienced. The girls' school is located on a farm just outside New Boston, Texas. In 1996, the population of New Boston was around 5,519 and has now dwindled to a mere 4,500. New Boston is just outside the largest city of Texarkana, which is right on the state line between the two states of Texas and Arkansas. Texarkana's population at the time I was at boarding school was right around 35,000 people. The boarding school was down a long dirt farm road a long way from the main roads. To get to the main road, you had to pass the Barry Telford unit, a maximum state security penitentiary. We were told, and I actually once witnessed, that if a girl tried to run away from the farm, that the prison would send guards and dogs to help look for the girl. If you tried to run away or got in too much trouble, there was threat of a place far worse than Holy Highway. It was called New Bethany. Apparently in New Bethany, they had corporal punishment. They made you wear strict uniforms, and it was absolutely a miserable place. I recently looked that school up to see if it existed, and the reviews I found were far worse than the stories I have to tell about Holy Highway. My heart and my sympathy goes out to the people that were stuck at that horrible institution. I was sent to Holy Highway in August of 1996, just 2 months shy of my 18th birthday. I was a kid that got homesick easy, so being this far from home was actually really hard on me. I didn't know I was going to the school, but was transported by my parents in the middle of the night or the early hours of the morning. It was August in Washington, so it had to be very early for it to still be dark outside. I was half aware of being on a plane and asking where we were going. I actually don't even remember the answer that I got, but I remember it being not very direct. The part about getting to Texas from Washington was a bit of a blur. I felt drugged and super lethargic. I slept in the back seat of the rental car and had slept on the plane as well. We stopped at a Wendy's on the drive from Dallas to New Boston. I still remember what I ordered to this day. It was a baked potato. I remember picking at the potato before falling asleep again in the back seat and feeling nauseous before putting it back in the bag. To this day, I don't think I could ever eat a Wendy's baked potato. Isn't it weird how sometimes we have those physical reactions tied to a smell or a food or even music? When we arrived at the farm, we were showed to the dorm I would be staying at. They showed me a huge plate of nachos on the counter with a paper towel over it and let me know that that was my dinner that they had saved for me. I was so upset that I didn't have the appetite, and I told them I couldn't eat it and I didn't want it, and that they could just eat it for me if they wanted it. They told me they weren't allowed to eat food that wasn't specifically given to them, so the dinner went into the pig bucket. One girl commented that nacho night was her favorite and one of the most favorite nights of dinner on the farm, and that someday I would actually regret putting my nacho dinner into the pig bucket. Not only did I cry the majority of the trip there, I remember crying for a good solid 3 days after they left me. My mom had packed for me, but the dorm mom had to go through all of the belongings to make sure that there was nothing that was not allowed at boarding school. Clearly, my underwear were not regulation for boarding school. They actually took a tape measure out and measured the sides, and the sides over the hip had to be over an inch, and mine were approximately half an inch, so they weren't up to code. And I was asking what we were supposed to do about this, and I was kind of a smartass and just suggested that maybe I would have to go without. They allowed me to keep them, but did tell my mom that she had to send me new appropriate underwear. My parents actually found out about the school from one of my classmates and childhood friends. Their parents went to my parents' church, and they had sent their daughter there about a year before I had gone. So that's how they found out about it. I guess I'll be freestyling a little bit for this portion, so I'll be able to look at the camera and not just be awkwardly reading my notes. But I have the topic of older girls and younger girls. So when you arrived at the school, The way that the program was set up is they would assign you to a girl that had been at the program for at least 4 to 6 months. This was known as your older girl, and you were paired up so she could show you the ropes and so that you could kind of meet the intake requirements to get off your initial probationary period. So we had to do things like memorize all of the books of the Bible. We had to memorize a bunch of Bible verses. Can't remember all the other things that went into it, but having grown up a pastor's daughter, most of this was pretty easy for me. So I was able to breeze through some of that and earn some early points with the dorm mothers. During those first 2 weeks that you were there, you were actually not allowed to talk to anyone except for your older girl. And they had us in a room where it was just the two of us in the dorms. So we didn't get to interact with a lot of the other girls. During lunch period, we also had to go to our rooms. So we weren't interacting with people. In hindsight, I'm sure this was like an observationary period to kind of weed out the troublemakers and see who they were going to have issues with. Once we were done with our 2 week probationary period, we were still paired up with our younger girl for another 2 months, most likely. I was pretty fortunate the first time and had a really sweet older girl that showed me the ropes, but the rules were very strict and kind of difficult to adapt to, even coming from a strict home before that. There was a pretty strict dress code. Anytime we left the farm, we had to be wearing dresses that went at least past our knees. Shoulders always had to be covered. We couldn't have any t-shirts with suggestive sayings. It was just, I don't know, not too hard to comply back then, especially for where it was. Daily inspections. So it was very strict. We had white glove inspection checks on a daily basis. And based on how we did our chores, we could either get merits that could be exchanged to buy things at merit sales, or we would get demerits. And if you racked up too many of those, you'd find yourself on hard labor, which you did not want hard labor. It's interesting because I think some of the effects of that white glove inspection kind of carried over today in the way that I fold laundry and clean. I'm sure that people that had a military upbringing could relate to this in some ways. I mean, you had to have hospital corners on the bed. They would go wipe the windowsills, the blinds, everything. So the chores were divided out through the house, and they would rotate on a weekly basis. So for 1 week, you might be on bathroom duty, and with that, you might also be sweeping the porches. Cook was always my favorite chore of the week, and my love of cooking probably started before I was in Texas, grew while I was there. Actually learned a lot of Tex-Mex inspiration and flavors, as well as some really cool Southern techniques for cooking. Let's see, a little bit on chores. School. So because this was a boarding school, we obviously had our schooling taken care of there. It was a PACE system, ACE accredited PACE system, and it was a self-paced learning system. It was, I can't say it was a great education by any means. It was absolutely ridiculous. I excelled at math before I got there, and then got into geometry and was completely lost, as many students are who find themselves decent at algebra, then they might struggle with geometry. There was no one to ask for help. I remember escalating it through 3 of the different staff members, trying to get the help that I needed with math and couldn't. Somehow fumbled my way through the test and was able to pass, but really felt like I didn't grasp the concept of it. It was also interesting coming into that school as a student that got straight A's, because many of the girls were lagging behind a couple years and their grades were failing. So they almost didn't know what to do with me. And because I was not a problem student when it came to education, I was a little bit neglected on that end. So let's talk about the dorms. We had 3 dorms, and they were called Faith, Hope, and Charity. They made us do dorm changes every 3 months or so, or they would switch out one girl if things got dicey with them or relationships started to get a little too close between people. There was a random shuffle when new people arrived. We were not allowed to talk about our past. That was a very strict rule that they had at the farm. We were discouraged from getting too close with anyone. And if we did get too close with them, they would put us on talk isolation from that person to discourage getting too close. In a time when you felt so disconnected and lonely, it was actually really weird to also be navigating building friendships that had any substance but looked like you hardly ever interacted on the surface. I remember one time being on hard labor and we would pass each other and make these little comments and try to be like ventriloquists and not let our mouths move as we said things. And we would look straight ahead so they wouldn't know that we were talking to each other. Each dorm had a dorm mother, and we had to say yes, ma'am, and no, ma'am to them. And coming from the north, we didn't really say ma'am and sir. So that was kind of hard to get used to. And I do remember getting in trouble in the beginning for forgetting to say ma'am. Some of the dorm mothers I liked, and then some of them were pretty terrible to us. I really enjoyed learning recipes and cooking techniques from Sister May and Sister Jane. And I actually still have this weird little bell on a blue satin cord. And there was a dorm mother who was also in charge of the school named Sister Karen. And she wore one of these and said that it was her bell to call her little lost sheep. She actually referred to all of us as her little lost sheep. And you could always hear her coming with that bell. So let's see, what did the average day look like for us on the farm? Monday mornings were called work program days, so those were always pretty consistent. We would wake up at our normal time and then have our chores, make breakfast. Breakfast on work program days was always the same. It was actually pretty good and it stuck with you for hours. So we would have scrambled eggs, we would have biscuits and gravy. The kind of work that we would do. So it could be anything from raking pine needles to building fences. It might be burning trash or working with the animals on the farm. It could be weeding the garden. Sometimes we mixed concrete, just any kind of random chores that you might do. It actually translated to like a shop credit. So that one day of the week turned into the shop credit, and then the chores that we did in the dorms on a regular basis translated to a home ec credit, which clever but weird at the same time. Tuesday through Friday was school. We would have breakfast, chores in the morning, followed by chapel and then school. During lunch, we would go back to one of the dorms. The dorms would rotate who hosted lunch on a weekly basis. After school, we would have either half an hour or 45 minutes of what they would call spiritual growth. It was a session in the chapel where we would listen to a recorded sermon. After chapel, we would get PE, which was absolutely the highlight of my day. A good portion of the time for PE, we spent playing soccer. And that was probably the only time when I was there that I had that little slice of what felt like normal life. I have a note about the garden. We had an absolute massive garden. We grew everything from potatoes to corn, peppers, tomatoes. And I do remember going out in the summertime and being able to harvest the fresh onions and peppers and make this amazing pico de gallo. Another odd memory that I have is this corkboard that was at the end of the hallway in each one of the dorms. And it listed out all the girls that were at the school, and it had our date of birth and our date of entry. And you'd watch blanks show up on the list, and you'd watch names get crossed out, and then the list would get updated. It was just kind of this weird thing to see yourself as just a number on the board getting rotated around and seeing yourself reduced to a number. I'm sure on a very small level, it's something that prisoners might experience going through their process. So in preparation for this series and this episode, I was doing some digging online and stumbled across a phenomenon that I'd never heard of before. And I'm actually really grateful for the research put out by Dr. Joy Shavarian, who coined the term boarding school syndrome in her 2015 book. Well, she speaks specifically about children at the age of 12 to 17. We actually were children when we entered Holy Highway. We were all in the formative years of our youth, our minds and emotions still maturing and developing, and we carry with us the impact of those experiences decades later. So what is boarding school syndrome? Boarding school syndrome is not a medical category, but a proposal that there is a cluster of learned behaviors and emotional states that may follow growing up in boarding school, which can lead to serious psychological distress. These can include depression, difficulty in forming relationships, and emotional numbness. It's a, it's a term applied to the long-term impact of boarding schools. I'm going to be going over the first two aspects of boarding school syndrome in this episode. This is actually deep stuff and was pretty triggering for me to dig into. It's sadistic to lean into and explore the dark and the macabre elements of the self, but I believe it's paramount in the process of becoming your fullest version of self, and I'm not afraid of the shadow work. I'm not afraid of the dark side, but embrace it in order to better understand and heal more completely. 1. Hidden trauma. The lasting effects of early boarding school is hidden trauma. A child is sent away from home to live with strangers, and in the process loses their attachment figures and their home. They're exposed to prolonged separation. They may experience bullying and loss. This combination leads to unbearable emotional stress. A young child does not have the mental capacity for creating a coherent narrative out of these events on their own, as they're unable to process it. This trauma may become embodied, leading to conversion, physiological symptoms, and a large number of psychological symptoms. 2. Bereavement. The term homesickness does not do justice to the depth of loss to which boarding school children are subjected to. The broken attachments of the first days in boarding school amount to a significant but unrecognized form of bereavement, and the child must learn to live without love. For the child, their losses are minimized and glossed over as insignificant. This contributes to the hidden aspect of trauma. The term homesickness encompasses a complex system of unprocessed grief, and many children are emotionally wounded, traumatized, exiled, homeless, and bereaved, grieving. Suddenly, children are abandoned and have to adapt to the abrupt and irrevocable loss of a childhood state. Children lose their role, their sense of themselves as people who belong in a family or group, and have to prematurely appear grown up. It is not uncommon for the repressed distress to come out in symptoms such as bedwetting, vomiting, and tears that are usually not permitted. I personally remember this is actually when my digestive issues and disordered eating patterns would start. The child may feel a sense of homesickness and homelessness. The repeated experience of returning home as a stranger and then leaving, just as a child has settled back in, builds a psychological pattern of expectation of being left, which is often unconsciously active in later life. These patterns of disruption of attachments are often replayed with a long-term partnership. This can also cause a psychological split between the boarding school self and the home self. If the child is unhappy but is given the message that the school is good for her and a privilege, then they feel like they have no right to complain. And this can lead the child to doubt his or her own perception. Although the child may conform, the confusion will likely remain, causing a second psychological split between the feeling of self and the thinking self. Another loss is the dependent state of childhood, and thus the premature death of the child's self. This can never be regained because when the child returns home, he or she is inevitably changed, then no longer trusting but watchful and alert for reaction and rejection. Once a child realizes her parents are not returning, the encapsulation of self occurs and a protective shell is formed. Deep within the armored self is the hidden vulnerable child who trusts no one. Overwhelmed with many physical manifestations of grief, something has to happen psychologically for this child to survive. And children have to learn to live cut off from their internal emotional turmoil. Maybe by sharing what I have experienced, it'll inspire some of you to face the scary stuff from the past that has long been buried. I've been thinking about this for a few years, and it's time to face the fears and just take the leap into it. In future episodes, I'm going to be sharing stories both good, bad, funny, and heartbreaking. I'm going to read online reviews and content and react to them. I'm also going to be interviewing some of my former classmates to share their stories and their experiences. And honestly, not all their experiences are bad. I have a friend that credits this place for actually saving her life. She had a really rough and tumultuous upbringing. She wasn't getting the love and care or even the 3 meals a day that she needed. And by finding this place and being sent here, she found a safe haven from the abuse that she was suffering in the outside world. But many of us have darker stories to share, and I am going to share one of those with you right now. This is one of the reviews I found on Yelp, and it's going to put into context a little bit of what we experienced at this school. I have locked my Holy Highway days away in a black box in the back of my mind. I was there for 9 months in 1999. My parents didn't want to deal with me being a normal teenager, so they shipped me off to Bible camp, as they described it. You get to ride horses and enjoy the simple things in life. Not sure what brochure they mixed up with this hellhole. Let me add that my little sister was dropped off at the Picton facility shortly after me. Our parents were done parenting, apparently. I was lucky to leave in 9 months. That was the earliest you could be released. The only reason was I was able to go because I finished my Bible classes, then schoolwork in that amount of time. I stopped talking and took my hard labor without a fight. I pretty much offended Sister Lucinda with my very existence. She would dish out hard labor to me for any little thing she could think of. I never let her see that I hated it, and that got under her skin. My most vivid memory is of her screaming in my face in the chapel that hard labor was not my personal workout time. Hard labor for me, since I had it all the time, was yo-yoing the tall grass, shoveling dead chickens from the coop, and then throwing them in the burn pile. When we had done everything there was, they had a nifty sand pile on one side of the property, and they would have us fill a large outdoor trash bin with the sand and drag it to the other side of the property. We didn't talk from sunup to sundown, and we were lucky to get a lunch break in the middle of our labor. We had a girl get a spider bite and watched each day as it rotted away a little more of her skin. They refused to take her to the doctor for several days. They did eventually take her after the dead area got too big for prayer, I guess. I was from a very verbally abusive home, so I was pretty hardened to it already. I watched the girls who obviously never endured this kind of treatment fall apart. They slowly became a beaten down version of themselves. This is just a tiny glimpse into the life at Holy Highway. If you are a parent and you send your kid to a place like this, you obviously don't love them. So yeah, that's some heavy stuff. Thank you so much for watching this episode. I know it's not perfect, but oftentimes the hardest part is just taking the first step. So with that, I am proud of myself for taking this first step today and beginning to share my story. Be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe for more content like this. And join me next time for my next episode on boarding school. And I'm going to share a little bit about how boarding school probably impacted my relationship with food and is responsible for some disordered eating patterns, but also is responsible for some of the fun recipes that I actually make to this very day. So join me as I explore the dichotomy of positives, negatives, and the lasting impact of boarding school.
I want to remind you all how important it is to take care of your mental health. Reach out to someone if you're feeling stressed or feelings of overwhelm. You're not at this alone.